It is September 26, 1983. A Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov is alone in a bunker outside Moscow, staring at a glowing red screen. The word on the screen reads, "Launch." According to his computers, the United States has just fired 5 nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. His orders are clear. Report it immediately. Let the Soviet military unleash everything they have before the incoming warheads land. Petrov doesn't move. He sits there sweating, hands shaking, and makes a decision that the computers are wrong, that it must be a false alarm. 23 minutes later, he is proven correct. The satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. The man who saved civilization from nuclear fire received not a medal, but a reprimand for improper documentation. Now ask yourself, what if Petrov had followed orders? How close we actually were. Most people think the Cold War was tense but controlled. They're wrong. Arms control experts have catalogued dozens of accidents, false alarms, system malfunctions, and aggressive military posturing that nearly triggered a nuclear exchange. Many were kept secret for decades. Some are still classified today. One expert soberly concluded that it is probably rather remarkable that no more serious engagements ever took place. The 1983 Petrov incident was not unique. It was one of many. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine was being harassed by American warships in the Caribbean. The submarine's captain and political officer both voted to fire a nuclear torpedo at the U.S. fleet. There was a third officer aboard that day, Flotilla Commander Vasily Arkhipov. He was the only one who voted no. Under Soviet protocol, all three had to agree. One man, one vote. That is the distance between the world you live in and nuclear annihilation. President Kennedy himself estimated the odds of that crisis escalating to full-scale war at somewhere between 1 in 3 and 50-50. What happens on day 1? So the call gets made. Petrov picks up the phone, or Arkhipov says yes, or any one of a dozen other moments tips the wrong way. Within minutes, Soviet leadership authorizes retaliation. Their doctrine was clear. Absorb a first strike and you lose the ability to respond. So you fire before the missiles land. American radar systems detect the Soviet launch almost immediately. The president is notified. The launch codes come out. From the moment the first button is pressed, the United States and Soviet Union together possess enough nuclear firepower to kill every living human being on Earth several times over. What historians later called the most devastating event in history that somehow didn't happen begins to happen. One scholar writing in the National Archives estimated that in a full nuclear exchange, upwards of 200 million North Americans would die. Harvard historian Graham Allison calculated that such a conflict might have led to the deaths of 100 million Americans and over 100 million Russians. And that's before counting Western Europe, which sits directly between the two firing ranges. Within hours, Moscow is rubble, Washington is rubble, London, Paris, Warsaw, Kiev, gone, the world that survives. Here's what most people don't think about. A nuclear war in 1962 or 1983 doesn't end all life on Earth. It ends civilization as it existed then. But some people survive. Rural populations, far from military targets. Countries in the southern hemisphere, largely outside the primary strike zones. Scattered communities in mountain regions and remote areas. What they inherit is a planet wrapped in nuclear winter, a phenomenon scientists had begun modeling by the early 1980s, showing that the soot and ash from burning cities would block sunlight for years, collapsing global agriculture and triggering mass starvation on a scale that would dwarf the bomb blasts themselves. The Cold War was not just between two countries. It was a contest that defined every nation on Earth which side you were on, which weapons you received, which economic system you ran. A hot war would have dragged in NATO on one side and Warsaw Pact nations on the other within days. The conflict would have been genuinely global from the very first week. There is no United Nations to broker a ceasefire when both Permanent Security Council members have missiles inbound. There is no Geneva Convention enforcement when there are no functioning governments left to enforce it. What never gets built, think about everything that came after 1983. The personal computer revolution, the Internet, the Human Genome Project, the International Space Station, the mapping of the universe, the vaccines that saved hundreds of millions of lives. All of it runs on institutions, universities, supply chains, power grids, and satellite networks that a nuclear war in 1983 would have shattered beyond repair for generations. A surviving civilization rebuilding from nuclear winter and the collapse of global agriculture would not be launching iPhones by 2007. They would be trying to grow wheat. The entire trajectory of human technological progress, already accelerating at an extraordinary rate in the late Cold War, gets reset. Not by decades, possibly by centuries. The one-man problem. What makes this particular what-if so unsettling is how personal it is. History teaches us to think of wars as movements of nations, armies, economies, and ideologies. But the Cold War nearly ended the world not because of grand strategy. It nearly ended because of sunlight on clouds, because of a malfunctioning satellite, because of a submarine crew under extreme stress, cut off from communication, making a split-second call. Stanislav Petrov was not a famous general or a world leader. He was a software engineer working a night shift in a bunker. He later said he couldn't be sure he was right. He just sat there with one hand on the phone and decided not to move. The difference between the world that exists and the world that was nearly destroyed is not a policy. It is not a treaty. It is one man's gut feeling on a Tuesday night. The verdict. World War III during the Cold War would not have been a war in any traditional sense. There would be no front lines, no occupied territories, no armistice negotiations. There would be a before and an after, and in the after, the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to their children what the world used to look like. We didn't avoid it because we were wise enough to build the right systems. We avoided it because at the exact moments it mattered most, the right individual happened to be in the room. That is the most terrifying thing about the Cold War. Not that it almost happened, but how many times it almost happened, and how thin the margin was every single time. How many people do you think know about Stanislav Petrov? Share this if you think they should.